Good morning, everyone, once again. Many thanks for being here in person and online. It's greatly appreciated. This meeting has been discussed, as Ayla mentioned, for quite some time, and we're very happy it's taking place now. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So yeah, as mentioned, our Regional Mixed Migration Center for Eastern and Southern Africa, Egypt, and Yemen. We also cover, thank you. We cover the southern routes, or southern routes rather. I will get back on the definition a bit later on. And basically what I will be presenting today are some more broader mixed migration trends that we see across the region, and then insights from our own primary data collection and research. Yes, so what we'll be seeing is a review of these trends. That's what I'll be starting with from our quarterly mixed migration updates. So now, if you're a little bit familiar with us, then you know that every quarter we publish these quarterly mixed migration updates, which are region specific. So what I've done here is kind of a starter also to all the presentations is provide an overview of what we've been reporting on over the last 5 years, particular to this region, and to also give you a bit of a taste on what we would normally include in our quarterly mixed migration updates. This is a lot of information. I'm not all going to read it out loud, but just kind of to show you or demonstrate the sheer amount of information we have collected from our partners, from local media, more international media, of course, from IOM, from UNHCR reporting. I think what I would like to zoom in here a bit on, and I think what will be one of the main topics of discussion today, is the underreporting, or rather a gap in information on these perilous journeys that people undertake, very large distances from East and North of Africa, from the Great Lakes, some a bit closer by from Southern Africa. And yeah, I've bolded here the reports where we basically had to report on refugees and migrants not making the end of their journey, and succumbing to very difficult situations along the way, and in some cases leading to deaths through road accidents, through drowning, etc. And here, very briefly, a little bit more on that in terms of how it's reported on in the media. I think also what might be most familiar to you in the audience when we talk about the southern route, in terms of like what you've heard and seen in the last recent years. I have included here, as I know that this is a topic of interest for some of you as well, information on the so-called Indian Ocean route. We know that it's not necessarily a route going towards South Africa or Southern Africa, but at the same time links to this region. So I thought in terms of facilitating the discussion for later on, I have included some reports on that as well. You see the information on the Madagascar reporting. So as mentioned, I will now move on to presenting some of our findings from our research conducted in South Africa. This research was conducted between September and October 2022, and it's comprised of a total of 468 surveys conducted with refugees and migrants in various locations in South Africa. So as you can see on the slide, respondents were surveyed in either Durban, Pretoria, Ekurhuleni, and Johannesburg. And these locations were chosen as notable places of transit and settlement for refugees and migrants. However, I think what will come up very much later, and what I already mentioned, is that obviously here, we're looking at people who had made it to South Africa. So this study did not include surveying people earlier on in the route when they were maybe transiting countries such as Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, etc. Good to mention is that the surveys were conducted with refugees and migrants who were 18 years old and above. This links to our own methodology and ethical guidelines. We do not interview children through our survey tool. We do on separate occasions through more in-depth qualitative, more child-friendly methods, but in this case, no children were interviewed. Something else belonging to our criteria is that we only interview people who had been in South Africa for less than 2 years to ensure we're capturing recent experiences, and we're not looking at people who might have been in South Africa for a very long time already, which would then not really inform current or recent mixed migration trends. In figure 1, you'll be able to see the distribution of the respondents according to gender and age. And in table 1, you will see respondents by country of nationality and by region. So we kind of divided it up into 3 main regions, which is what the rest of the research will also do. So if you have a look at it now, you'll see we have Southern Africa, East and the Horn of Africa, and Great Lakes. And in this case, we also included Tanzania and Great Lakes, although we do know that sometimes through their SADC membership, this is already counted as part of Southern Africa as well. Moving on, first a little bit more on limitations to this study. So, I mean, as you could gather from the sampling criteria I just mentioned, the process was not randomized. And obviously, when we're talking about people on the move and about refugees and migrants transiting, they often do so through irregular or partly irregular means, meaning that they're largely hidden. So this means, in other words, that the data are not representative of all those traveling along the southern route. We cannot guarantee that we have covered all profiles, given that these people are so hidden. Then second, to capture diverse profiles and looking at all these different regions of origin, as you may have seen in the previous table, some populations are represented by relatively small subsets. So we may only have a couple from certain countries of origin within the overall sample. So that means if we were to do a follow-up study, we could do larger research or zooming in on particular profiles within that larger research to get a bit more targeted findings for specific profiles. As I had already mentioned, and what is evident from all the media reports that I included on that second slide, is that many do not arrive in South Africa. So what we're looking at here in this study is only examining the experiences of refugees and migrants who did manage to make it here in South Africa, arrive here. Nevertheless, we believe that this study and its findings can provide important insights into the diversity of profiles and experiences of refugees and migrants traveling along the southern route to South Africa, and as much as possible also provide a base for triangulation with other existing studies, including the ones you will hear about today after my presentation. A little bit on how we define the southern route before we move into the findings itself. So for MMC, I think our definition is a little bit broader than for some other organizations, but in reality, we see the southern route consisting of several migratory routes. So we have a route going down from East and Horn of Africa to South Africa, often through Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and then either Mozambique or Zimbabwe or both, with key transit locations including Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Lilongwe, Tete and Maputo in Mozambique, and Harare, as well as Bay Bridge in Zimbabwe. Then the Great Lakes region to South Africa is mainly used by people originating from the Great Lakes, particularly the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Burundi. and then they are joining similar routes from Tanzania or Zambia onwards south. So first zooming in on the first group of East and the Horn of Africa, what our study demonstrates is that 22% of this subset used entirely, exclusively overland, very long journeys, often transiting, as mentioned, Kenya, Tanzania, and then Malawi or Mozambique, and some Zimbabwe. We found that overland journeys are more common for men. Women may travel through different means, or for example, through air. But this is also linked to the finding that we found that women more often traveled after their husbands. So they had received support for their journey from spouses that were already in South Africa. Journeys took an average of 97 days, representing very long and precarious trajectories. Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Maputo were cited as the most common transit locations for these long overland journeys. In Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, respondents were mostly looking for transport or to connect and interact with smugglers to facilitate next steps of their journey. In Maputo, there was more reporting on having to stop for immigration controls and resting and looking wait for transport. Now, moving on to the Great Lakes region, so people originating from the Great Lakes, we're really talking mostly about Congolese and Burundians here. Also mainly overland journeys, with Congolese traveling through their country south until Lubumbashi, and then connecting into Zambia. Burundians, however, mostly transited Tanzania, so they went from Burundi to Dar es Salaam and then connected with those coming from East and Horn of Africa region before going south. Journeys were a little shorter, as distance was also shorter, with an average of 31 days. Women reported even shorter journeys. So also here you see women sometimes traveling after their spouses had already arrived in South Africa. Most cited locations of stopping: Dar es Salaam, Lusaka, and Harare. And people cited mostly doing so while waiting for transport, followed by looking for smugglers and also resting. Then finally, looking at the subset of Southern Africans moving to South Africa, mostly comprised of Malawians, Zimbabweans, and Mozambicans. Might come as no surprise that obviously these routes are much more direct and shorter. And in most occasions, people cited trying or having access to the most direct routes to South Africa. An exception were the Malawians. Most of them cited transiting through Mozambique, either through Tete and then Zimbabwe, or through Maputo and then directly into South Africa. So that also links to most reported locations for stopping, which were Tete, Maputo, as well as Bay Bridge. Also good to mention, obviously, is that there is an important difference between this subgroup and the other two groups when it comes to movement agreements within the SADC region, which obviously is not the same for those coming from the Great Lakes and Eastern Horn of Africa regions. They face very different experiences with regards to bilateral agreements facilitating mobility. Drivers of movement. I'm not going here into depth to be cautious of the time, but obviously we'll be happy to share the presentation with you after, but this is a very quick overview of the whole sample, so all respondents and what they cited as reasons for leaving. So we see economic drivers on top, but violence, insecurity, and conflict is pretty high as well, particularly for Eastern Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes. Moving on now to a subset of questions we have around interactions with smugglers. So how do people move? and how do they interact with smugglers who facilitate their movements. So smuggler use was particularly high among respondents from East and Horn of Africa. So we're talking about Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and South Sudan in this case, versus demonstrating 73%. This was versus 53% for Great Lakes region and 39% for those from Southern Africa. Good to mention, obviously, as well, is that those from East and Horn of Africa may face greater legal in terms of mobility opportunities, visa-free agreements, etc., barriers, but also social cultural barriers. So thinking about language barriers, etc. And also notable to mention that despite less visa and document restrictions in place, still over a third from Southern Africa cited using a smuggler, 39%. Respondents who did use a smuggler across all groups most often used only one along this very long journey and used it for multiple services. So when you say multiple services, you can look at the table below, looking at transit across borders, for example, but also dealing with authorities at checkpoints, in-country transportation, and basic needs, including food or water, accommodation, etc. On the right, you will see some quotes from those respondents who had used smugglers and basically their experiences, which sometimes might be seen as a little contradictory, but at the same time, it's part of these longer journeys where people may experience that at the same time, the use of smuggler could prevent them from risks, where in other occasions it actually puts them at risk. So looking at that, at the risks along the journey south. So over half of all respondents cited they have been in at least one dangerous location along their journey to South Africa. Maybe to no surprise, overland journeys were considered the most risky. So particularly those respondents who had done their journeys overland entirely. Then when talking about the types of risks or challenges that people face, they most often reported on detention, robbery, and bribery or extortion. Then looking at the top 4 dangerous locations, Maputo, Mozambique's capital, came out on the top, followed actually by Gauteng province. So not just talking about Johannesburg, but the entire province. Bay Bridge between at the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and then finally Dar es Salaam. You will see also in the map the icons, so those kind of represent what they saw as the main risks in those locations. So what we can see briefly is that in Dar es Salaam, we're looking at detention versus, for example, in Maputo, it was more about bribery and extortion, whereas in Bay Bridge, it was really a variety of risks that people faced. Finally, on to recommendations. I don't want to preempt all of this, as I think we're going to have a discussion afterwards. However, our study does provide these initial points of recommendations for a variety of actors. So I just wanted to include them here also to mention our study is available online, mixedmigration.org, and there you will be able to access these findings as well as the recommendations. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much. Very informative presentation with relevant information. Question, colleagues, online and in the room, or remarks? No question. Mampi, is there any hand raised online? No? Okay, please.
Thank you. Before I make any comments or questions on the theme and on some of the important questions we're trying to answer, just a methodological question. The surveys conducted by the Mixed Migration Center, are they once off? You mentioned they are quarterly and they are specific to specific regions, but do they reoccur at specific points in time so that we can have a look at some kind of trend over time? Is there a time of year where this is happening more than others? Are there specific years where there is a peak or a lull? The impact of COVID-19, of course, are important issues to take into consideration. So I'm just wondering about the regularity of the surveys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I just take this question, or are we gathering some? I go ahead. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for this question. I should have maybe been a little bit clearer. So the first part I presented on the quarterly mixed migration updates, these are updates that we where we basically gather all secondary data we can find. So it is, in this case, not the Mixed Migration Center conducting surveys, but rather we scope the internet, we talk to partners, we take evidence from the ground. We're part of the Danish Refugee Council, so we also have colleagues in a lot of field locations on the ground who are able to provide us with information. And there we provide these quarterly updates. For our surveys, we work as much as possible through partnerships. For example, this study was conducted in partnership with the government of Denmark, the NIDA, and it is a bit more subject to funding, the funding environment. So as Ayla had already mentioned earlier, unfortunately, the southern route often doesn't get that much attention as other major migratory routes do in Africa. And this study was conducted in 2022 and is our most recent effort to date along this route. So I think when it comes to gaps, this is definitely what we would cite as the key gap, that there's no capacity so far to really conduct this more, as you described it, more quarterly or more regular efforts to capture these movements. I think one thing to stress as well, and this is, I think, where we also differ mostly from IOM, is that we do not capture, as IOM does, IOM DTM, we do not capture numbers. So we would not be able to tell you the volume of people moving along the route, but we're really zooming in on their experiences. So we would be able to look more into over time, if we were able to conduct surveys regularly, for example, if risks have increased, if people's reasons for leaving have changed or have been impacted by factors over time, and if their intentions have changed. So I think something also to stress here is that although we're here in South Africa and a large number intends to move to South Africa, this is not the case for everyone. Some people cite that South Africa is not their final destination, or actually change their intentions over time once they realize or experience certain things along the journey. I hope this answers your question.
There is a question in the chat box from Elena. Elena, would you like to open your mic?
Thank you. Yes. So thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering, as in other studies you performed, you were asking respondents if they moved with children, with their children, or as caregivers of children. So I was wondering if also in this case these questions was posed to the respondents.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you for joining today. Yes, our 4MI survey does ask respondents if they were traveling with children, or in general, if they had children, if these children were with them during the journey or elsewhere. As you do know, in East Africa, in partnership with Save the Children, we have collaborated on more child-specific research. This was not the case here, but regardless, our survey does capture profile information about children. Yes.
Thank you. And was there any specific finding on this?
Our main findings, I think, do not differ as much from what we already know, is that the route is largely traveled by men who are not accompanied by their spouses or children, and single women who either join their spouses already in South Africa or travel alone. So relatively not as many children on this route, which I think can also be explained to how long the sheer distance of this route compared to other shorter routes. And we're also not looking as much as for example, currently in South Africa at conflicts induced cross-border displacement. So we're not seeing these as sudden displacements as we would see currently, for example, out of Sudan into neighboring countries where you more often see entire families moving.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Yes, Jesus.
Thank you again, Jim. Very interesting findings. My question will be related to protection services along the route, because I think it was very interesting to see your findings about the role of smugglers in particular. Hopefully not causing that. But yeah, my point will be like, to what extent you have found along the route the role of NGOs, governments, because there seems to be a lot of hotspots along the route. So what's the role played by NGOs, governments, social services with some of these people that are crossing different countries, and whether there could be any other role, strength and role of those services across countries. Because precisely it's something that we are also wondering as UNHCR. We talk about this route-based approach. It's something that we want to look at. So yeah, I was curious to hear if all these people that are on the move are interested to get those services, are just, or on the contrary, they just try to leave as soon as possible and try to reach South Africa only through a smuggling intermediation. Is there any space for those services across the road to play a more meaningful role? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your question is very pertinent. I think the first part of my answer would be is that we may get more in-depth understanding on this if we were to survey in transit locations rather than in South Africa, because then, so for example, we do ask people what needs they have. But obviously, if we were to ask them in those transit locations themselves, then it would be more fresh to their minds, and we would know exactly which needs they would need when in these locations that you're interested in. I think that the second part to think about here is that our findings on smuggling kind of reveal that while people move these long distances, often with only one smuggler. So it already points a little bit towards how hidden these populations are, and that while they transit in these locations, that may not automatically mean or necessarily mean that they would have access to or well, liberty or have access to access these services. I think quite a high number of respondents cited detention or perceiving a risk of detention in Dar es Salaam, in Maputo, as well as Zimbabwe, which could also mean that they, although there might be these services available, they would not feel comfortable perceiving there to be a certain risk for them to render themselves more visible. So I think definitely, yeah, we would need to do more in-depth research in these transit locations to further perceive what blocks people from accessing these services, if they are perceiving risks that will block them, or is it also linked to the ways how they travel with perceiving these long hidden irregular journeys really the only way possible to make it out? I think also what we know from secondary data and what we've reported on is that once you get into detention, we have examples from Tanzania where people were stuck in detention for years. So that could really further emphasize why people moving might be so afraid or not inclined towards accessing available services, but rather remaining largely invisible.
Please, you can take the floor.
Thanks for the presentation. I'd like to ask maybe two questions. One will be is a follow-up of what Diego asked about the regularity of the surveys. We, as the National Planning Commission, are more interested in the long-term studies or data that will have at least some kind of impact or a way of assisting us in terms of planning. So our mandate is more on the long term, but we also look at the medium term planning because there should be a link between the two. So we're interested in trends data. So whether it's this survey, despite the challenges you mentioned, probably one of it is to do with funding. Is there an intention to do it on a regular basis and over time, every 5 years or 10 years or even beyond? That's what we are more interested in, so that when we do our long-term plans, we know that some migrants might be, we need to know at the back of our mind to keep that at the back of our mind, that some people might not be accounted for, but they will have an implication on the plans we have, whether in the short to medium term or over time. So that's the first part. Then the second part is that I see that you collaborate with IOM, and in terms of the push and pull factors related to policy, I think there's a study they did, and I'm hoping that they shared with you, where they looked at, I think it covered Southern Africa. Princel might be a better place to explain the study a little bit. But the interesting part is it had a part where it focused on the providing countries, looking at their policies and also the receiving countries' policies, to see whether that becomes part of the push and pull factors, in addition to other factors as well. So my interest is to try and see that, one, because you collaborate, do you have access to that study and do you have access to the findings, so that it becomes part of what you're working on, because it has an impact in one way or the other, whether directly or indirectly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Responding first to the first part of your question, I think, yeah, this is very much the ideal for us as well, to be able to, over time, give updates and information on trends. So I think what we're presenting here is a snapshot of what we found, but also to ask further attention for this route, how it's underrepresented in narratives and debates. But yes, our survey would lend itself to do these more trend analysis over time, and we could survey according to, for example, what we partner with or what the interest would be over X amount of time, to see if people's experience change, or more importantly, if the profiles are different, and also if people perceive different risks along their journey. Maybe good to mention here as well is that MMC in other occasions has implemented the longitudinal research. So we were able to survey people a first time, conduct a so-called baseline survey, and then remain in touch with them and survey them again after a certain amount of time, let's say after 6 months, to see where they were after 6 months, if they have moved, if their plans had changed, and if they had had different experiences in the meantime. So that's another way of seeing over time, actually, with the same people, if something had changed with regards to their experiences. I think with pertaining to your second question, I think yes, I think today is also very much for us a platform of further strengthening our collaboration with IOM, with UNHCR, with other participants in the room, and we would be very keen, obviously, to have our research side by side and see how that connects to each other. As I included a couple points relating to policy, but we did not survey in depth on policy. So we did make those links, but indeed, I think it would be very interesting to put that together and see what we can further draw from that.
I have a question from Sarah Foss and Arjan in the chat box. Over to you, Sarah.
So much. It's really interesting. My question is on the composition of the people moving, because you mentioned it was mostly single males. And in our experience for UNHCR, at least speaking about the Congolese and the Somalis in particular, is that we do see a trend whereby the man comes, and then a few years later, like, he will establish himself here, and then a few years later, the wife and children will follow, and presents a very kind of unique challenge in terms of registration, because there is issues joining their files. So he might come and enter the asylum system, and then when the wife and children come, sometimes they have to either register separately or they have to go through a rather kind of cumbersome process of family joining, which oftentimes leaves them undocumented or undocumented for a prolonged period of time because the family didn't arrive together. So I was interested to know if in your interviews there was discussion about, I'm planning to have my family join me, or if that was something that you asked, or if, as you were saying in your longitudinal studies, if that's another factor that you could look at. Because, well, of course, when we're on the ground and when our partners are on the ground, we're not seeing a lot of single males from those nationalities. We're seeing over time complete families, and over time also more and more families who are undocumented or partially documented due to this challenge of the family joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that makes a lot of sense, given that this might also be partly a function of how we sample, that we only survey people who had been here up to 2 years. So if you're talking about this longer period when rest of the family joins eventually, then we would not capture that if we're talking 2+ years in South Africa. I think we do see it, as I mentioned, in the reverse way, that we surveyed women who had recently arrived with their spouses already for a longer period in country. So yeah, we kind of captured it that way, that we do see a lot of these movements happening, particularly, yes, among the profiles you mentioned, from the Great Lakes, from the Horn of Africa. So yeah, I think in a way it does connect. We do not have in-depth questions on our survey about particular difficulties they would face with regards to their file. We would know based on intentions, questions we ask, if they plan to go in that route, in that direction, and apply. But yeah, no, we wouldn't have that kind of in-depth detail, which would maybe a qualitative in-depth interview would be more suitable to really get at those particular difficulties arising.
Oh, please, and then Melissa. Arjan, do you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. Jim, I have a very basic question, because you're talking, I think the routes are mainly leading to South Africa. You nuanced that a little bit in your presentation. But my question, so a very basic one, and excuse me for my basic understanding of the phenomenon. But why is it that people are motivated to go all the way to South Africa when they have an opportunity to stop over a fairly stable and economically interesting countries like Kenya in particular, Tanzania perhaps? Is there, do you have any insight into this that you can share, or that you can help me understand with?
That's a great question. I think once again, if we were to survey transit locations, we may further understand the challenges that people face in locations like Nairobi, Dar es Salaam. What we also see, particularly with regards to Ethiopians and Somalis, is that these are very specific communities and specific geographical areas of those countries who move to South Africa. So we're also talking a bit here about a culture of migrating to South Africa, where it's already established beforehand that that's the final destination. So that doesn't count for everyone, but we do see particularly for these nationalities that it's very particular groups who engage.
Melissa, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's always, so I'm from the IOM Regional Data Hub, and I thought it was super interesting, your presentation on some specific findings that you shared, because they either complement our data in the DTM, or they, make me question, present new questions that we can dig deeper into our data. So thanks for sharing. So I have a few questions, but maybe I'll just, maybe I'll just share them, and then three, and then you can maybe address the most, if you don't have enough time to address the three, maybe address the most pertinent one. So my first question is, so you reported that women from the Great Lakes region reported shorter journeys than men from that region. So I was wondering, do you have information on why that is, and why the women report shorter journeys? And then my second question is, do you have data on this is relating to your slide on the drivers, migration drivers. Do you have data on the region of origin disaggregated by province? So as you mentioned, for example, in Ethiopia, people migrating on the southern corridor, they're coming from very specific communities, right? And usually in DTM, we see that they're migrating for economic reasons, from SNNP, etc. So it would be interesting to see if the people moving for conflict rather than economic reasons, to see where they're coming from. And then my third question is relating to the quotes from that Ethiopian woman that you mentioned, saying that if you're a woman, don't travel alone or don't use smugglers because of risk of sexual abuse. So to use visa and permits instead. So this made me question if you have information on the segregation of migrants by regular or irregular status. And this is coming from, because we have a lot of information on this on the Eastern Corridor, that there's the difference, like a gender difference between regular and irregular migration in that corridor. But this is like a very specific contextual case. So I was wondering if there's a similar phenomenon in the Southern Corridor that you found, but maybe for different reasons. Thanks. Over.
Thank you very much for these pertinent questions. I'm going to try to be a bit brief, to be mindful of the time, as I think we have to start moving on. But I think there will be also more room during the discussions to further talk about this. On your first question, this was mostly motivated by a larger share of women compared to men traveling after their spouses. So their spouses had already established themselves in South Africa, and they were more often able to maybe at least have a partial segment of the journey traveled by air, more often than compared to men. Second question, yes, we do have this data. We do ask people on their region of origin. This is not always, if we, for example, think about Ethiopia further down to Warda level, so really talking about regions such as Oromia, Amhara, Tigray, etc. I think very much comparing to what you see is that we do see often with regards to Ethiopians in particular, that those arriving in South Africa more often cite economic reasons. But at the same time, this question in our survey is multi-select. So meaning that while they might stress economic reasons, they could at the same time still also report being affected by conflict and violence. If you were to be interested in this more particular data on profiles, I have to stress that given that we try to really diversify the sample, our numbers are quite small, as you could see in that table, but we could follow up on that and further discuss what we see with regards to these particular profiles you're interested in. Then I think the last one is on the quote. Yes, we do have this information. I will kindly ask Ayla here if she will be able to share a bit more in the chat, because I know that it was in my notes, but I had to omit a little bit to be sure I wouldn't go too much over time. But yeah, we actually ask our respondents if they can self-report on their status. So our enumerators, who are often refugees and migrants themselves, will never ask a respondent to show their official documentation according to ethics, but we do ask them to self-report. So we actually do have that information ready per region of origin with regards to people identified as irregular migrant, asylum seeker, refugee, etc.
Thank you, Jim and colleagues, for your question. We still have 2 more presentations before the coffee break. So there is, we have 2 reactions, one from Sarah Nayeja from Malawi and another question from Arjan. So may I suggest, Jim, that you answer on the chat box so we can proceed with the second presentation. The second presentation will be done by IOM, Ms. Princess Dasapa Venkatesamy, who is the Regional Research Officer, and she will be presenting with Christopher Zapp on migration dynamic and access to protection services from the Horn of Africa to Southern Africa.
So much. So the IOM presentation will take place over 2 parts. We'll begin with my colleague Chris from the Regional Office Nairobi, who will speak about their research that they have undertaken with migrants from Somalia and Ethiopia. And then I will do the second part of the presentation, looking at the actual flow to South Africa. So over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Princelle. Do I need to share from my side, or what is the suggested modality?
You can go ahead and share from your side.
Okay. It seems I'm unable as a participant to share.
Chris, I will rectify that very quickly. Just give me 1 second. I'm making you the co-host. Okay, you should be able to share
Great.
now.
Thank you, Ayla. So yeah, so while okay. I hope you can see in the correct mode.
Yes,
Yes, we can.
fine.
Okay, great. So yes, I guess good morning, colleagues. My name is Christopher Zapp. Full disclosure, I was previously based in Pretoria, working with Princelle and others, and I recognize some of the faces in the room. So good to see some colleagues from within IOM and outside as well. I'm now based in Nairobi, and as Princelle mentioned, I will present some findings on behalf of some of my colleagues here in Nairobi who have conducted some research along the southern route, particularly looking at some the communities of origin in Ethiopia. So I know we're a bit over time, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, and please interrupt me if we need to move along or otherwise, because the findings are kind of a bit in depth. So first I will kind of provide an overview of some of the findings, kind of emanating from the Eastern Horn of Africa, specifically on those communities in Ethiopia. And then Princel will look at another study done by colleagues in Pretoria, particularly looking also at some of the access to protection services, which I think was mentioned in our brief discussion just now. So yes, I'll just get right into it. This is again a study that some of my colleagues conducted over the past couple of years, starting from 2020, in a couple of different phases. So this is sort of the amalgamation of a couple of different data exercises. So it first started in mid 2020, after sort of the pandemic, doing a sort of a scoping study with key informants along the route to understand where some of these movements are happening, and to really kind of lay out the groundwork for the research. And then it kind of targeted based on those findings, a community of high immigration, that's in Misha in Ethiopia, and we'll look at some of those findings. And also looking at some migrants, or some migrants, specifically those Ethiopian nationals in transit in Tanzania, 2021. And then it also looked at some of our returnee data that we collect institutionally at IOM through our Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Program, AVRR. So it's looking primarily, at Ethiopians, those emanating from Eastern Horn. And I think Princel will kind of touch upon some of the dynamics, further south along the route. And again, this is just to highlight, I think some of the discussions we're having, which is already leading into the plenary, I think we'll have. So maybe we've already addressed some of those, but this is very much, initial findings, and I think some of the trends, etc. It's something that we do hope to collaborate specifically with MMC, others, as we move forward. So this is just to provide a bit of a deep dive, but I think indeed we hope to provide some of the more trend line analysis, as was sort of mentioned previously. So again, I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but we all sort of understand it, particularly looking at immigration from Ethiopia down south to ultimately South Africa. This is historical in nature, based on different regime changes in both countries, also increasing economic activity in the 2000s, the World Cup, etc. And this is also primarily concentrated in areas in Ethiopia and the SNNPR sort of regions, and that's where Misha, some of the findings will be presented. Based on our findings here in the regional data hub in Nairobi, we can estimate around 10,000 movements, more or less, are heading, south to South Africa from our what we call Fulmarting Point in Moale, which is in the southern border of Ethiopia. This is largely, and I can state with quite an magnitude of confidence, very underreported. So there is likely a lot more movements, and these are just what we've been able to provide previously. But I think, again, as we kind of enhance our data collection activities and integration along the southern route, some of these movements will have a bit more clarity on them, as now it's a bit uncertain, let's say. So looking at specifically this immigration community in Misha, which was identified as a high immigration area from Ethiopia to South Africa. It's a community that is largely reliant on small scale subsistence agriculture. A lot of the families are, almost only a quarter of the families are able to provide for themselves in terms of self-sufficiency. There's a lot of high rates of unemployment, particularly among youth, and underemployment and low wages. So this is kind of just giving a context. I think we all understand a lot of these movements are due to dire economic constraints in areas of origin. and looking specifically at, sort of the culture, some of the ingrained sort of beliefs and practices within the community itself. This is very pervasive migration as sort of a coping mechanism, let's say. So almost 90% of the households surveyed considered sort of migration very or somewhat common. And you can see in terms of the areas of destination, South Africa was pretty much the sole country of destination. And then looking at the attitudes towards migration, this is also really important to highlight that I think this goes to show for everyone, regardless of your status or your economic circumstance, migration is not something that you want to do willingly. It is sort of due to destitute or otherwise, very constrained environments that some of these communities of origin are facing. So we, in this study, there is a lot of mixed attitudes towards migration. So a lot of the heads of households, there's sort of reluctance, willingness to permit, children or youth to migrate. It was sort of a last resort in some cases. So they, I think there's a lot of mixed feelings. And I think what this research highlights is that, migration is not something that is, favored or, is done lightly, let's say. And there's certainly a reluctancy by those particularly, family members, those who are, who see some of these family members migrate to actually take upon the journey. And then in terms of, the risks associated, I think we all, some of the challenges that Jim highlighted, and we'll also get into in Prince Health's findings is, a lot of these communities are aware of the risks, but that doesn't necessarily deter some of these movements. And also the levels of risk aversion sort of differ across generations. So, heads of household are a bit, again, more reluctant, and, they perceive, higher risks. Whereas, the youth, those who are probably more predominantly going to be those migrating, might have a lesser sort of or a higher risk tolerance, let's say, towards taking the journey. And then also looking at some of these networks. Again, this study was looking primarily at Ethiopians, also to some extent Somali and Eritrean nationals, making the route south. So this is, and I think one of our colleagues was mentioning it before, in terms of, a lot of this is happening through a lot of familial connections. So long established networks, again, since, the 90s, when some of these regime changes were happening, where, one person may go from the family or extended family, and they will maintain the connections, and some of those, communities of origin will maintain that connection and will facilitate some of those migratory movements. So this is really, it was really evident in some of the findings that it's a lot of these movements were influenced by family members or those close to the, potential migrant in the area of destination. And then looking at the routes, this is kind of, I know Jim also kind of presented a bit on this as well, but just highlighting again that, it's a very fluid and dynamic route. Some of the movements start regularly, and then they move into irregular fashion, or vice versa. And it's, it's very driven by these smuggling networks and the smuggler themselves. So there's not a lot of agency for these migrants. And we're also seeing, different maritime, also some of the air routes, particularly from Mogadishu. I think we saw that a lot of the Somalia, the migrants coming from Somalia, those who had the means, would fly to Maputo and make the onward journey from there. Again, the duration, I think similarly, I think you were saying about 3 months in MMC findings, yeah, about 2 to 6 months, and the cost is about 5,000 USD. These findings again are about, I guess a couple years old by now, but These are just sort of indicative estimates and kind of showing the different travel routes. The profile, I think this was also a bit discussed in terms of, particularly on the southern route, we see a lot more younger male migrants. This contrasts with some of the research that we conduct, or the findings that we regularly sort of see on what we call the Eastern Corridor. So those Eastern Horn, Somali, Ethiopian migrants going towards the Gulf, which are, there's a lot of movements due to domestic labor. So there might be a higher proportion of women along that route compared to the southern route, which was, much, more proportionally representative of males. But if the women that do migrate, either do it through existing familial connections, I think, as our colleague mentioned, or through more regular means, through marriage and other sorts of purposes. So that's sort of some of the profiles. I'm just trying to, cognizant of time, I think I'm just trying to briefly go through some of these findings. And then some of the protection risks, I think we all, Jim kind of had a nice overview of all the different incidents that have been happening over the past recent years that we're all aware of. A lot of these, again, because these movements are happening in not necessarily voluntary nature, so migrants themselves are really up to the control, or the sometimes coercion of the smugglers themselves. So we're seeing instances of suffocation or other sorts of very very unsafe and very highly a lot of protection risks along the journey. And I think Princelle will also get into this a bit in her presentation, so I won't go too much into detail here. And then also looking at remittances, this was also very important for these migrants in areas of origin. So on average, there was those who the families that were sending some of these migrants were receiving a bit more remittances and therefore had a bit of a higher standard of living. But the findings kind of found that some of these were not very regular, and it kind of depends, I think, on the familial connections. But it's very an important part of the economic prospects, let's say, of these communities of origin, and again, it kind of facilitates that network migration narrative. And then in terms of return and reintegration, this is a lot of because, again, looking at some of our assisted voluntary reintegration and return data from IOM, it can be very challenging for those who have returned because of perceived failures of migrants themselves, and tensions within the community or within the family in terms of perhaps wasted opportunities or wasted economic resources. So it's a very challenging environment. So when some of these movements, return movements do occur, the protection risks or the vulnerabilities do not go away, let's say, and perhaps they might be even heightened because of just the tensions and some of those perceived failures that they may experience from the family members and communities themselves. And then also, just I think this is my last slide, looking at the intentions, so perhaps remigration. This finding, or this study, kind of found that while yes, a majority sort of did want to stay after they did make it back to their area of origin, a small plurality, so about 46%, kind of felt that they needed to stay because of, again, some of these challenges with family members in terms of these economic resources that were perceived to be wasted or would have to be reinvested again. So it's a very challenging environment. Looking even from origin to transit to destination all the way to return. So I think the entire the route needs to be examined in that regard to really understand the different dynamics and the protection concerns that each migrant faces along the entire journey. So I think that is my last slide. I will now go to Princell, and I don't know, Princell, if you would like to share from your side, I can continue from my side as well.
Thanks, Chris. Big here will share the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, let me just stop here.
Good morning again, colleagues, and I will take the second part of the presentation, which was research done by the IOM together with UNHCR and the Southern Africa Migration Management Project. The consultant for this is also on the call, Ms. Tara O'Brien, who undertook the task of conducting these interviews with migrants along the different parts of the southern route. So thank you very much, Tara. And the objective of the research that was undertaken was a pilot study on the driver of mixed migration flows, migratory dynamics, and available protection assistance that are available to migrants along the southern route. And this was done apart from literature searches with primary research conducted at different points of the research. And the countries of origin that were focused on in this research was Somalia and Ethiopia. And the countries of transit where the research was undertaken was in Southern Africa, in Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And as we've already touched on by different presenters, the country of destination is considered to be South Africa as the major country of destination. But this is indeed changing, and we will look at some of the other emerging routes as well. And one of the speakers, one of the delegates had asked about why is it still South Africa? And this is a valid question, understanding that South Africa is facing its own economic challenges, having high levels of unemployment, around 35%, high levels of inequality, and indeed xenophobia as well. And if you were able to read the quotes that Chris included in his presentation, migrants are aware of the high levels of xenophobia in the country, of the burning of shops, of the actual attacks on migrants, but yet South Africa is still perceived as the major country of destination. We do see emerging routes, migrants moving to Botswana, Namibia, as well as Mayotte, and we will touch on Mayotte in another slide. So what do we know of the southern route from this research? We look at mixed migration. What do we mean by this? And mixed migration is a profile that includes economic migrants, irregular migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, unaccompanied children, smuggled and trafficking persons, environmental migrants or climate migrants, amongst others. And the exploitation that is faced amongst migrants in these routes include exploitation by criminal networks, corrupt officials, smuggling and trafficking, as we've heard. And this ranges from physical, psychological, sexual, as well as labor exploitation. Now, whilst we've seen that the route is still largely male-dominated, we do understand that there is the existence of feminization of migration, and this is a critical feature in light of, if we look at international migrants, we see that increasingly women are moving on their own, they're moving independently, and they have their own sets of protection needs as well. So what else do we know? And this has been highlighted by previous speakers. We'll highlight some of the cases going back in the last few years. And if we look back to 2016, we see that 19 Ethiopians suffocated and died in a container truck that was carrying Ethiopians from Tanzania into Zambia. In March 2020, the bodies of 64 Ethiopian men were discovered in a shipping container at the back of a truck at a security checkpoint in Mozambique en route to South Africa. They had died as a result of suffocation, and 14 survivors were found amongst the dead. July 2022, police in Malawi impounded a tanker truck carrying 42 Ethiopians into Malawi Along the route from the border with Tanzania, passengers looked frail and in urgent need of medication and food. One of the migrants told the police that the group had been in transit for at least 4 months to get to Malawi. October 2022, 25 bodies of Ethiopian migrants were discovered in a mass grave in Malawi. 25 victims were men aged between 25 and 40, and the evidence indicated that the men had suffocated to death and the bodies were then dumped by the smuggler traffickers. The last example is December 2022, where the bodies of 27 men believed to be migrants from Ethiopia were found by the roadside in Lusaka. Men were also aged between 20 and 38 years old and had died from suffocation in transit. And this is just some of the examples that are found, that are reported. IOM also has a program on missing migrants that does record some of these deaths. And this just shows the protection needs that are needed along this route. So what were some of the protection concerns that emerged from the research that Tara undertook on the route? So we look at them being physical conditions and health, and the quotes are included next to it. So one reported that if someone is too sick or injured to walk, they are just left there in the bush. No one knows what happens to them. If we look at dangerous and cruel smuggling practices, some of the guys fell in and drowned. No one stops to save them. And this was an Ethiopian male who had crossed Lake Malawi with about 100 others. Violence and abuse, and this was from an informant at a camp in Malawi. If an Ethiopian girl is beautiful and the boss likes her, he sleeps with her. The bosses do whatever they want. Then we have prolonged imprisonment. We are very stressed because we do not know when we can leave. And this was an interview done in a prison in Malawi. And then death and missing persons. If you looked in the bush in Tanzania, you would find so many bones, all of Ethiopians. And this was from an Ethiopian community leader. So this just highlights some of the protection concerns that migrants face along this route. So with regards to access to protection services, none of the migrants interviewed accessed any humanitarian assistance or other protection services during their journeys. There was a question on this earlier. The only exception was if they were arrested. Any assistance mentioned was from private individuals along the way, including from diaspora members. And we need to acknowledge that these are hidden populations that do not want to be seen, that do want to protect themselves. And this then does leave humanitarian and protection actors with major access to challenges. So what about emerging routes, and what do we know about this? One of the emerging routes is the Western Indian Ocean route, which is a subset of the southern route, but a deviation along the Mozambique Channel towards Mayotte. The route is predominantly involving DRC nationals due to language affiliation. However, a few numbers from Sri Lanka have also been identified from the research. Now, although the scale is still small, the impact is enormous due to the limited capacity to deal with issues in Comoros. In January 2023, 30 stranded migrants were identified in Moheli, which is an autonomous island that forms part of the Union of Comoros. The migrants interviewed had asked for asylum, of which 12 were from Burundi, 18 from DRC. And this also included 11 children as well as 6 women. Now, some of the recommendations from the study, which will form our discussion today, is to include education on immigration procedures in awareness raising programs in different countries. IOM has been asked already by the government of Zimbabwe to assist with this. To strengthen protection services to vulnerable migrants along the route through capacity building, provision of immediate, short and long-term assistance, including the option of voluntary return. More investment in research and data to better understand the dynamics of mobility, including the impact of climate change during the current patterns of migration in the region. And one of the focus on this is on the harmonization of data to ensure that we are using similar definitions, to ensure that we are measuring similar dynamic as well. And lastly, to facilitate the implementation of key interventions in the countries of origin at the macro and micro levels to address root causes of irregular migration, which I know is easier recommended than done. And to promote interstate consultative cooperation, as this does involve different regions, apart from involving different countries. And IOM did undertake, together with UNHCR, the interregional consultation on mixed migration, which took place in November 2023, which included countries from SADC, as well as the Eastern Horn of Africa. And then a proactive approach that we are not always being reactive, to keep abreast of emerging routes in the region through investment in data and research, to pursue alternatives to lengthy detention, and to expand return and reintegration support. So, Chair, we will pause here for questions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The chair has changed. Allow me to introduce you Professor Lorraine Lando, who will handle the moderation and the Q&A session for IOM and the UNHCR presentation. Over to you.
Thank you. You may have been wondering what I was doing up here. So now I'm finally being activated. So I'll just let me begin by asking if there are questions for Princel. We will have a chance for a more general discussion later. So looking for specific questions on the IOM presentation from Chris and Princel. It's hard from where we're sitting to see them online. So we try to rely on our colleagues here who can see the screens a bit more, but let's start with if there's anyone in the room. And I can't see the back corner, so please also, if there's anyone back there, please just raise your hand. I could say Jesus, and then we'll come to the back.
Professor, and thanks, Princel and Christopher. A follow-up question on the presentations related in particular to the Ethiopians. Very interesting findings about the route that they are undertaking. My question will be, what are the findings as regards once they arrive to South Africa? How do they try to regularize their status, if they try? And to what extent they resort to asylum, seeking asylum? We see from the statistics from Home Affairs that Ethiopians are still a significant part of the nationalities that seek asylum in South Africa. So I would be curious to hear more on those trends. How many of those that were interviewed seek asylum in South Africa? What were your findings in this regard? Thank you.
Thanks. Why don't we take a few, just because we are running a bit behind time, and then come back, but make sure that everyone gets answered. So our colleague in the blue shirt in the back, and then I think we have a question. Apologies if I'm getting your name wrong.
Thank you for the presentation from the two colleagues. I'll be quick. So I'm interested to find out that based on the last recommendation of forward looking, so what can be done in future or being proactive. So in my mind, I'm thinking of although the organization's mandates are more confined to the eastern route, obviously towards the south as well. So I'm also interested to know that what based on the literature and some of the background information, how does the eastern route towards the southern part compare with the western route toward the southern part? Are there any similarities? Are there differences? And just based on that literature, how do you see them compare? And is there anything that can be mentioned because the receiving country is the same from both sides? Thanks.
Much so comparing the East to South Africa from West Africa, I suppose, and from East Africa. Is that the question? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. And we'll just take Madoda's question, and then we'll give Princell and Chris a chance to enlighten us with their responses. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I applaud you for this very, very informative presentation. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick question. I made an observation during your presentation, and I'm just interested to find out, not from a protection point of view, but also looking at it from a smuggling perspective and trafficking perspective. When you look at the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, have you observed how well along these routes these countries have domesticated these international legal frameworks? Because I'm aware when you look at UNTOC, when you look at the Palermo Protocol, there's a great emphasis on the provision of protection to victims of trafficking, to victims of smuggling. We know they sometimes sort of move away from that as a victim without even knowing that they are victims. But have you made any observation on that level in terms of what countries could do better in terms of having a comprehensive protection and through a legal framework? Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Madoda. I don't know whether Chris or Princell want to speak first, but I'll leave that to you to negotiate.
So you can go ahead first and I'll go after you.
Sure. I think, yeah, because the first question is about specifically about the Ethiopians claiming asylum. So actually, the study that I presented did not include a sample of, in the community of destination in South Africa itself. So it's primarily looking at community of origin, transit, and returnees. But I'm looking, at so it kind of also relied on key informants as well as literature review. But looking at the study, it's also, you can see the link to our website, or at least the region, the data hub in Nairobi, the website there, where you can access the report. I can also put it in the chat as well, if that's easy for colleagues to access. But look, it's actually findings from MMC that was referenced in the report, saying that at least in 2017, almost all the irregular arrivals from Ethiopia and Somalia were applying for asylum in South Africa, mainly, or perhaps because of the sort of free movement, ability. Once you apply, you're able to free, and it's not sort of a camp-based system. So that was just a finding, or based on the literature review. In terms of the comparison between the Eastern and Southern, I don't know if that was maybe geared towards you. I know the last question is perhaps for Princell. The second question, I was a bit unclear, but maybe if Princell, you want to touch upon it, I can also complement as needed.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Thank you. So with the regularizing of status, we did find that migrants from Somalia, Ethiopia do come to claim asylum in South Africa. From the research, many indicated that they have still been waiting a number of years due to the backlog, but that was documented in the research. And if anyone from HCR also wants to add on that, that would be appreciated. Now, the difference with the routes from West Africa to South Africa, and then the Eastern Horn to South Africa. So we find that while we have not conducted as in-depth research on the West African route, what we do know is that this route is not so much used through land, but that these migrants do fly to South Africa. So this is just from initial research before we undertake a study on this. So we find that this would have, different protection needs. But when we look at migrants from West Africa right now, we see that they are normally not pursuing the land route. Now, this could also be, as indicated by MMC's research as well, is that when the first family member or someone from the community comes, the second route becomes shorter because they're able to, number one, have generated some money and funds to be able to support the next person from coming. And seeing as this route has been existing for a while now, this could be the reason why the land route is not so much used as opposed to the air route. But this is definitely a research that IOM is going to pursue. And then the last question on what can countries do better? This is a very valid and good question, because these routes involve multiple regions and then, of course, multiple countries, multiple borders, even within the same countries. We do need engagement across borders. We do need countries to be talking to each other along the routes. It's not up to security or police or Ministry of Immigration or Home Affairs or Interior, whatever it is called, in one country. It's definitely amongst the different countries, and we do need to increase dialogue amongst the different actors in the multiple countries for us to be able to do better and to be able to, for migrants to have better access to these services, better access to knowledge before embarking on these routes. Thanks.
So will be a chance for more general questions later. So when we'll need to move through, but Diego will give you the last one for your colleagues at IOM.
Very much, Prof. Landa. Yeah, I'm trying to separate my comments for the general discussion from the presentation made, and I think I will just keep it to one or two points that I'd like to make. A comment was made towards the end of the presentation by Pritzel about the impact of climate change as a possible explanation for these routes being taken, amongst other reasons. So I just wanted to know what kind of research or what kind of data is informing the impact of climate change for these movements. And I suppose at the bottom of all of this, we're asking ourselves the question, why are people not getting access to humanitarian services? I think that's really at the bottom of all of this. And I think what we're seeing is that these mixed migrants are an invisible group of people are moving clandestinely through the continent with the assistance of smugglers, with whatever means are possible. And as people enter a particular country, the country's attitude is, why me? Why must I help you? Why is your help not coming from somebody else? So I like the recommendations about more dialogue, more conversation about how do we help such people, but also about informing such people about the risks that they are likely to engage on. A similar study was taken in West Africa amongst West Africans who are planning to use the Mediterranean route, and what the impact was on their decision to migrate once they were informed about the risks of migrating, and that many people then decided, I'd rather stay. We see the same thing with people in South America moving through the Caribbean Gap through to Central and North America. Exactly the same thing. So I think some kind of information campaign about what the risks are, and are you willing to undertake those risks need to be undertaken. Yeah, so that part is just a comment, but I'll reserve my other comments for the general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lauren. My point is it's a comment on the gender of the mixed movement mentioned several times in the presentation from IOM and from MMC. And I think there is the need to have a deeper analysis on gender dynamics to be able to consider adequate protection response and solution, including gender-based protection systems or protection entry system in the transit countries as well as in the destination countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, Princell, anything, would you like to respond now? Chris, okay.
Yeah, I can take Diego's comments on perhaps the climate change. I mean, for the Southern Dream that I presented, the survey was, it was up until 2021, so it was a bit, a couple of years ago now, and it was before, at least in the Eastern Horn, we saw sort of this historic drought and then subsequent flooding with, El Nino, and I know that impacts, different countries along the path now in terms of drought in some of these transit countries. So indeed, I think this is an area of perhaps when we're looking at the plenary and we're sort of looking at next steps, climate will certainly be an area where we need to investigate further as it's impacting not only the communities of origin, where, that will probably induce some of these movements because, that'll impact the economic livelihoods, et cetera, of these potential migrants. But then in the areas of transit and how that might impact some of, the movements, even the destinations. So I think, I can't speak specifically for the study that we've presented, but I think it's an area that we will continue to sort of monitor and investigate further. I don't know if Princell has anything else to add, but thanks.
Princell has ceded the floor. She'll come back later, I'm sure. So we have one more presentation before a break. I know it's a bit of a marathon session, but I appreciate you sticking with us. So we will now turn to Cleve, I think. Am I saying your name right? Masamba from UNHCR. So you have, your 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. We, as UNHCR, will be presenting this situation. We will narrow it to refugees and asylum seekers. I can see that the IOM and MMC came with a broader picture of mixed movement in southern route, but from UNHCR presentation, we will narrow it especially only to refugees and asylum seekers because. So our presentation will have the following point. We will give you the overview of the refugee population in Southern Africa for 2023. And also we will show the regional analysis of the refugees and asylum seekers disaggregated by route of their arrival in the country of asylum. And here we'll narrow this analysis because we are doing it for all the region, the 16 countries that we cover. But here we'll just give you the proportion of Malawi and Zambia that we have completed. And then we will show you, we will present it to you also our summary of all one movement, especially for refugees and asylum seekers that has been identified by our biometric identity management system in Southern Africa. And then we will have the route-based approach. And the last point would be the partnership that I think will be key for all of us from the previous presentation, the second one, and this one of the lessons that we have seen that we need to work in a partnership. So those are the points that we will be presenting to you this morning. So in terms of the refugee populations in Southern Africa at the end of 2023, we have 10.1 million in all of the 16 countries covered by UNHCR. And 84% of this possibly displacement populations came from DRC, are hosted in DRC. And then we have 34% of asylum seekers are in South Africa. So this is the way I can present this. And then also we have around 1 million of person that has been displaced because of climate change, especially in Mozambique, in DRC, in Malawi, and I can see because it's over there. So you can see that I put a red circle at the down corner of the presentation. So this is the way we present the populations, the forcibly displaced population in Southern Africa. We have refugees, we have IDPs, internal displacement persons, and so you have all this detail. And all these details are available in our portal. So you can go to our portal and you will have this detail. And also it's shared on the monthly basis. Each month we share the updated version of this population from the Southern Africa. The first aspect we have looked to look at the driver of this movement, and here we have used the artificial intelligence to analyze all the claim of the refugees, the 10 million that you have seen, by human beings. It's very difficult to do that. So we have used the artificial intelligence to look at all the drivers that all the claim the refugees that has shared with us based on the movement. What was the drivers? And after this exercise, you will see there is a lot of word schemes because it's a claim that every single refugee shared with UNHCR. Then what we have done here is to look at which word is coming out of that claim. And the first word we have seen on all those claims we have analyzed of refugees and asylum seekers in Southern Africa, the first word came is insecurity. The second word is conflict. The third word is war, instability, persecutions, fighting, rebel, and etc. Then okay. And then all the words are in that picture that I don't know how to call mosaic or picture. It's there, and here it's in a different languages. So there are words in Portuguese, in French, and in English. Because the region we cover in Southern Africa, we have countries that speak French, we have countries speak English, we have countries speak Portuguese. So we have that data analysis to see which are real words the refugee in the claim when they have been received in different UNHCR offices they raise. So this is the funding that we have. Then in terms of looking at the roots, and we have narrowed this exercise to Zambia and Malawi. You can see that most of the refugees we have in Malawi, 81% came by route. And in Zambia, we have 62% came by route. Then they are very a small proportion, but most of them came by route. And this exercise, we will extend it for all the countries that the UNHCR cover in Southern Africa, southern regions. And when it will be available, when it will be completed, it will be also shared in our website. After the regional overview, then here we'll be looking at the old world movement in 2023 that we have identified with our biometric identification system. So in 2023, all the worldwide movement in Southern Africa, we have identified 3,331 movements. So those are refugees and asylum seekers are moving across the southern regions. And here we have presented the movements that we have identified since 2029 up to 2023. And also we have shared the profile in terms of socioeconomic profiles, protection specific needs, and also in terms of skills, those people who are moving. And also we have shared a bit a dimension to look at the trend from January to December, how many, where we had more peak. I think there have been one of the questions was asked since at the beginning, do you have some data that can show the trend? So here, but this is just now to refugees and asylum seekers, not all the mixed movement in the region. So that's why one of the points in our presentation, we are saying that partnership, we need to work in a partnership, then we can better frame this topic together in this region. So here you can see the trend when there have been a peak, there have been down. So that's the situation we have. And then also in terms of profile, I can see that most of the research came that there are more women who are moving. But here, when we look at the profile of the refugee and asylum seekers, we have more men that are moving. I think it's I can see what, yeah. I think it's around 58% that we have identified in 2023. And also we have disaggregated to see if who are moving, they are refugees or asylum seekers or of concern. Other of concern are those group or those individuals that are linked to the refugees. They are not refugees. For instance, a refugees in Malawi can marry with a Malawi or a Zambian national. And both together when they are moving, that Zambian person, we as UNHCR, we identify as other of concern. So is in a relation with a refugees, but he is not a refugee. So that's why you see there is a 1% of all of concern that are moving. And there is a graph showing which countries these people, this group are moving. And it's, I think, very visual. And the top nationalities that of refugees and asylum seekers who are moving in the region, the first one we have seen is DRC. And the second is South Sudan. The third is Burundi. The fourth is Somalia. And then Rwanda is also where they are moving from DRC and what are their destinations. So, and all these are available in our website. Here, what in this slide, we have done a kind of to map all the route, all the movement of all these refugees in 2023 from where the departure and where are the destination. Here we have two lessons that we can share with you. The first, from UNHCR perspective, we have seen that there have been a lot of movement between DRC and Uganda in 2023. You can see on the screen that between the traffic between UNHCR and Uganda is improved. So that's the place we have seen there have been a lot of movement. And then the second movement are in green, the area that we have circled on green on the map. It's Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, that the three countries. And what we have done based on, because we have a sample or we have identified 3,331 persons who are moving in 2023. And then we need to look the sample in South Africa, what the South Africa in terms of mixed movement came. And one of the big samples we have seen is the outcome of the National Statistic Office of South Africa based on the result of the census they did in 2022 that came with a proportion of people who are moving, and also the country that are sending most of the people in Southern Africa. So that's why we have identified those countries. We put Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi, as you can see in the green on the map. And looking at movement in 2023, one of the area that we have seen that also those people who are moving between Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, they are using land routes. And the entry point that we have identified in Zambia, we have you are maybe I would not pronounce those names properly. Pulungu, Nakonde, Kasumbalesa, and in Malawi we have Sangwe and Chichipa. And we have even given also a percentage that we have seen of those move toward those entry points. So I will end here, and then I will give the floor to my colleague Jennifer, who will continue with the route-based approach as well the data partnership that UNHCR would like to extend with all the stakeholders in the region to better capture the issues related to mixed movement. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Cleve. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Could we please move forward to the next slide? Just in the interest of time, I'll just get straight into the route-based approach. Yes, so I take this opportunity on behalf of UNHCR to elaborate on the route-based approach to strengthen protection and solutions in the context of mixed movements of refugees and migrants, and of course, other very vulnerable persons moving along the migratory routes. So just a little background on the concept of the route-based approach. The task team on the onward and mixed movement in headquarters in Geneva, co-led by UNHCR and IOM, have initiated the route-based approach to reinforce ongoing work along several migratory routes, which includes the southern route and the Indian Ocean route. So I just created the slide, which gives you a context. I know that this has been, addressed in detail through the various studies conducted by MMC and IOM in joint collaboration with UNHCR. However, I think it's just a good refresher for us to go through this context again in order for us to really understand the relevance of this route-based approach, a whole of route approach that is really essential as a way forward. So basically, we are looking at this concept as a way to address the current management, mixed migration management, and how we can go about this through the route-based approach. So I will not go through all the details, but I'll just flag some of the points on the slide. And as mentioned, these slides will be shared with you after the workshop. So yes, you could have a look at them in more detail. But just to flag that refugees are amongst those moving along in the mixed flows, as Cleve also had shown in his presentation. And many of the individuals, irrespective of their motivation for the journey, they use the asylum systems, the channels in the country of asylum, to obtain legal stay, causing asylum systems to become backlogged and overwhelmed, which was also mentioned by Princell. And this chaotic, again, mentioned by Princell IOM presentation, that there is indeed an anti-refugee, a rhetoric narrative going on, anti-foreigner, and this is exacerbated Right. So six pillars have been identified to help guide these interventions together with the 6 enablers. So what do we mean by this? When we talk about the 6 pillars, this also has been identified at a global level by the TTOM again, the task team on onward and mixed movements. However, this is a guideline, in order to help us to look at it within our own context. And right now, since we are discussing the southern routes and the Indian Ocean route, we could see how we could use this 6 pillars as a form of guide in order for us to help with our interventions. So I'll just go through them again very quickly. It could be really elaborate. We could have a really detailed discussion on this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch upon the service. And this would be, of course, an ongoing dialogue and discussion over the coming months. So when we talk about protection sensitive, the first pillar, protection sensitive entry and admission, it's primarily looking into interventions at the borders and save lives and reduce the harm along the routes. And this can be done by ensuring rescue at sea and land. So when we look into the second pillar, strengthening asylum systems for refugees and rights-focused migration management, we are talking about lawful arrangements among states to ease the pressure on asylum systems and to contribute to responsibility burden sharing. For example, exploring the possibility of readmission agreements between states. So this is really like, a cross-border consultation. That's the purpose of the whole route-based approach, looking beyond the borders, but looking at the route. When we look into addressing immediate protection and assistance needs and comprehensively addressing trafficking and smuggling, we are looking into how we can reduce the harm. And by addressing the immediate needs, we can look into long-term needs. But right now, when you look at the whole route-based approach, it's about really addressing the immediate needs. And this can be done through early identification and referral of refugees and vulnerable migrants and those with very specific needs like victims of trafficking, children. And we make sure that they are channeled and referred through appropriate channels of support. So providing the relevant information to them through the involvement of communities, working really closely with communities. So communications with communities is really, really essential. Then we talk about protection and rights-centered options in countries. So this could be, we can look at it together with the safe, legal, and complementary pathways, where we are basically focusing on creating alternatives to dangerous journeys all along the routes through rights and access to services and economic opportunities. So an example could be ensuring that refugees and migrants have documentations to access solutions. So when we look into the sixth pillar, which is the safe and dignified return, readmission and reintegration of migrants and voluntary repatriation of refugees, we are also looking into making sure and ensuring that fairness in the asylum and migration processes with prompt, humane, and dignified returns through voluntary repatriation and lawful migration channels. And just very quickly on the 6 enablers. Now, why do we call them the enablers? Because they are cross-cutting elements that go through all the 6 pillars. So, and one of the main enablers, which is the data analysis, research, and route mapping, is what we are focusing on today in today's workshop, because this is essential, very relevant, and vital for us to find solutions and to really manage migration. So yes, so really relevant, enhanced data collection and capacity for analysis are key. All the other enablers are equally important, which I will not go through in detail, but as we can just pick a few, like We have advocacy, partnership, and collaboration. Actually, partnership and collaboration is what we would address in the next slide. So please, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So to support with the response to the challenge of mixed movement through a whole of root or whole of society approach, cross-border coordination. Again, I cannot emphasize on this enough, between all states. When I say all states, I mean states of origin, which is as we have heard, it starts from the east of Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region, and it goes all the way to the destination country, which is in South Africa and countries in the southern region. And also, if you look at the Indian Ocean route, then the destination would be Mayotte. So practically, we can only manage this through partnership and collaboration of all stakeholders working along the route to meet the needs of refugees and migrants, and of course, the vulnerable population. And shifting to humane and effective responses, people-centric approach, again, I emphasize on this, accountability to affected populations and communication with communities. All this is essential. These are all key in order for us to deliver better outcomes for those on the move and those affected communities and states. So I want to just quickly touch upon the points where the first point talks about engaging with states, regional bodies in the harmonization of migratory policies in the region, including the implementation of the SADC, Regional Migration Policy Framework and Action Plan. Again, there is a regional policy framework, and this has been thanks to IOM and collaboration with IOM, UNHCR, SADC, all together have come together to have this framework. And so it's really important to work towards its implementation. Cross-bureau meetings and coordination, collaboration, emphasized again. And now I just want to touch upon this third point, and I may also request you, Cleve, to please compliment me in case, I have not really touched the essential points, but this is something that has been, it's a very innovative pilot project that would be implemented in the coming months. Maybe we will focus on one region, one of the borders that we know are extremely active, where we hope that this is called in short form, in acronym is SDMM, which the long form would be the System of Detection of Mixed Movements. So we hope that this tool will complement current PRIME's UNHCR database. As we know, UNHCR PRIME's database is not available in all the countries along the route. For example, South Africa, they have their own government-private database for registration and for the asylum process, and hence we're not able to capture the detailed data on individual circumstances as we do with PRIMEs in these states. Hence, we hope that the System of Detection of Mixed Movement tool will be the one to enhance or complement where data is not available through UNHCR PRIMEs. Now, what is this tool? So basically, this tool is very simple. It's just a questionnaire. It's a questionnaire that has been developed by UNHCR, taking into consideration all elements of data protection, where the questions would address drivers of the movement, would address the protection risks, available services along the route, and other relevant information that is very essential for us for data analysis and to understand the route better. So this questionnaire would be available as a survey, through a link. QR code would be available to all persons on the move who have access to electronic devices, where they could fill in this survey. It's a self-service. There would be no key informants there, no UNHCR or partners to actually help them as they're filling the form. It is purely out of their own self-will But we would advocate for it. We would make sure that through community leaders, through the refugees themselves, through UNHCR presence in the various countries along the route, we would advocate for them to fill in this questionnaire with the hope that together we could find solutions through the data that is collected. And once the survey has been filled and submitted, then we would have the data immediately synchronized directly into the UNHCR Prime's database. And this is protected data. And it goes into the UNHCR COBO. Sorry, I'm not a technical person. So in case there are more technical details needed, maybe we could address it in the question answer round, where Clef can explain a bit more detail on the technical aspect of it. But from protection, I'm aware that this would be protected. The data will be protected. It'll be confidential. And we hope that this would motivate people on the move to be proactive in filling out this questionnaire. And hopefully the data that we receive could be of relevance to us, duty bearers who have to protect them. The last, again, I'm just conscious of the time. And so I just want to touch upon the last point, which is the UNHCR cross-regional data collection project, which is has been initiated. And this is primarily to collect data along the Indian Ocean route, where the focus at the moment would be on Comoros and Mayotte. But we would hope that if the pilot collection works out, if it's successful, then we would also like to move to Tanzania. But for the time being, the collection has been done for the refugees that were relocated to France from Mayotte, for approximately above, I think, well, I'm not sure exactly of the numbers, but it was a substantial amount where we have had an initial collection of data, and we hope that the results of that data will be significant for us to have a better view of, better idea of the movements in the Indian Ocean route. So thank you. That's all for my side. I give the floor back to Clef and Ursula for any additional comments to complement. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think I will be hand over to Professor Lance. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I know we're well over time now. So what I'm going to propose is that if there are any quick questions for UNHCR, for Clef or Jennifer, we have them. Otherwise, we take a sort of 10-minute break and we'll come back and have our final session. I know people will need to leave at 12:30, so have to be conscious of that time. So are there some questions now on online? It's hard to see anyone.
Can we open the chat?
All right, so is it Edward? Maybe you could just join us by voice if that's possible.
Yes, colleagues, good morning. I have a question here, and thank you very much. I have a question here from one of my own colleagues and it goes, would this survey consider connectivity issues along the routes? Also, not everybody would have access to tablets or phones to fill in the survey. How can we also ensure people's understanding of the questions? Any comments on that?
Thank you, Edward. Are there any others that before we turn it over to UNHCR? All right, Clef or Jennifer, I'm not sure if you have an answer for Edward.
Clef, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, the questionnaire will be available offline, online, even in a QR code. And our focus is to make sure that the community leaders are well informed on how to use that questionnaire, because the mover are living in a community. So if we can better enhance our awareness or our guide properly the way that the community can lead this tool, we hope that we think that they will be able to capture those informations. And also we are thinking on how this will be more user friendly. So that the component we are looking. So we are not going really to ask a very complicated question, very simple questions that can lead us to collect some data. And at the end, maybe this was not properly, this was not included in the presentation. There is a better data triangulation, but it's a business intelligence is equipped from the question. It's not the question. The question, you fill just the data. But when we receive that data, we'll be doing a data triangulation with all the technology that we have to make sure that the way the question was entered, the way the question will be analyzed to get a better understanding of what exactly it is. So there is a very comprehensive data analysis that is integrated to the data triangulation to come up with a better outcome. And this is also will help us to mitigate the bias that in terms of the question that the data that we are collecting. So this is the way we are envisioning this. So there will be some questions that you answer. Based on your answer you have provided, we have like a kind of scoring, so we can see exactly the magnitude of the reliability of the information you have provided. So there is a lot of process that are integrated that the end user would not see, but we will be able to see and analyze the data and provide the required analysis or pattern related to mixed movement in Southern Africa. Over.
Very much. I'm gonna now just hand it to Ursula. I think you had an announcement about the group photo, perhaps. Oh, there's another Ursula. Okay.
Oh, it's the same. It's the same. I don't know if we are done with question.
I have one question. I don't know whether you see my hand or not. It's just a quick one, if you may allow me, Ursula. And my question is on the role of the transit countries in protecting people on the move and respond and provide services to people in need of care while on the move. I'm not so sure whether the 6 pillars that had just been presented summarizes entry points for member states, for stakeholders and partners. I just wanted to get some clarity whether that would be a safe point of reference to use in terms of what is it that member states and stakeholders and members and other partners can do in protecting people on the move. And also apologies if this would, if it preempts maybe upcoming presentations. Thank you so much.
Jennifer, may you please come to answer that questions?
Hello. Yeah, sorry. Well, I don't know who asked the question, but yes, I'm sorry if I didn't understand fully, but what I could get from the question is that you'd like to know the role of the state and the stakeholders within the pillar, right? Within the 6 pillars. Is that correct?
No, I was just saying, thank you. My name is Jacinta from the SADC Secretariat.
Oh, Jacinta, sorry. Yes, all right.
I was just saying that, is it safe to assume that the 6 pillars, all 6 of them, summarizes various entry points for member states, stakeholders, and partners in protecting people on the move?
Yeah.
Can we use that as an entry point when we engage with member states to say that you may, for example, look at the protection, you may look at, strengthening asylum seekers, something along those lines. I don't know whether I'm clear. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yes.
No, thank you, Jacinta. Thank you. And sorry, I didn't get, I couldn't see the name with the voice. And no, I just want to thank you so much, first of all, for where you had confirmed that SADC is really open to working closely with UNHCR, IOM, and all the stakeholders on this. So thank you for that, first of all, Jacinta. And to answer your question, yes, this is exactly what the purpose is, that all the 6 pillars would be an entry point for all stakeholders, so we all have a role to play in this. It's just how we need to, we can say, further collaboration, further discussion as to how that could be done. And this is simply a framework. It's just to provide a guideline to make sure that we do not, miss out on these essential interventions. But how we go about it in terms of the entry, in order to further make it a reality, to make it practical, this is what we call by ongoing collaboration and discussions. So yes, I would agree with you 100% that these are the entry points, along with the enablers, because the enablers are really essential for all the 6 pillars, where they're all cross-cutting. When we talk about, we talk about advocacy for protection and rights, and we also talk about strengthened engagement with the community. So all of the enablers are essential, along with the 6 pillars. And yes, I confirm that these are the entry points to interventions. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Very much so. Thank you so much. Very clear.
That we have is there was some other activity on the chat. I'm not sure whether questions. If there were, I see that there's a few who are making comments. But if there are questions, can you just sort of step in and ask?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, with data triangulation, we'll use primary progress. Primes, I will use primes, not progress, primes 2. That will be our primary data source that will be doing a triangulation. So when we receive a data from that questionnaire, the first thing would be the first layer of our business intelligence engine is to look at the progress data, if those people exist in progress data or not. That's the first things we'll be doing. And then if they don't exist in progress data, and then we'll be looking at the nationality too. And which nationality a person who is asking a question, who submitted questions. And also we have integrated in the questionnaire some geolocalization data to make sure that the person who is answering the question is not in Malawi. He can say that I'm in Malawi, But when we look at the question, we need to see also if a person is in Malawi or not. So this is really, it's very technical, but I will not go in depth. But if there are more questions, I'm happy to answer in writing. But we are looking at all those perspectives to make sure that the answer that we have and the way we do the data analysis for those questions, for data we received through those questions, went through a robust data triangulation with more evidence before we share the outcome. Over.
I think we will. We probably should take a break, so we have a few minutes left for general discussion when we come back. So Ursula, please.
Before or after the coffee break, we can take a group photo. So let's do it after the coffee break. Thank you.
But there's another question of asking, why are we collecting this data when we know we have a lot of data and no one is listening? I mean, if we look at the policymaking processes in Southern Africa, in Europe, in the United States, the data are there and they are not shaping policy. So do we somehow think that collecting more of this data is somehow good to shape policy when it's not there? And in fact, probably what we need to do is have better data on those policymaking processes so that we can understand, as many of you have said, how we can get people to listen rather than simply throwing more data in their direction. I think there's another question And it hasn't come up today because we've been focusing on sort of official data. But of course, data on migration in the continent is being collected, but it's being done by Elon Musk. It's being done by the cell phone companies. It's being done by trucking industries and transport industries. Those data are already existing, and many of them are being mobilized already, but not for the reasons of protection, but for reasons of control and intervention. And I think we have to be very careful that, well, are we being redundant? We're already so far behind. What's the point? The people who are going to use that data already have the data they need. They're not going to be looking to us. And we need to be thinking carefully about how those data are used, and we as a collective group try to regulate the use of that kind of unofficial data, which is providing, let's say, the forces that we're working against with the tools that they need to intervene and to in fact make things worse for migrants, right? So I think we do need to be a bit more careful in how we collect the data, making sure that it's better contextualized. I was quite struck when you were talking about the number of people who sort of died en route, and it's tragic, but we are coming up to the Easter weekend here, and the number of South Africans who will die on the roads in the next 4 or 5 days far outnumbers all those migrants who died en route coming to South Africa, right? So is this the crisis that we think it is? Clearly, no one should be dying, but we do need to contextualize this within a process. We do need to contextualize this not within broader political things. People will move. It's not abnormal for them to move, right? To try to embed this data in a lot of other things that are not just demographics, right? We didn't talk about, I think some of you mentioned we need more on children. Yes, we also need more on the elderly. We need more on neighborhoods, right? We talked about all of the data you presented were on countries. What about the difference between rural and urban? What about the difference between people living in wealthy or poor neighborhoods? We don't know any of those things. They're not showing up. But if we want to intervene, it's often that micro level data and that comparative data that we need. So just lastly to say, right, we right now, I have the impression that a lot of this is, we hope for data to lead policy. Right now, it seems that the policy is leading the data, that we're collecting the data to inform policies that are already underway, right? And that is a compromised situation. And we do need to think about how we create a network so that the data can be there. We may not get the policymakers to listen, but that we are collecting the data that can critique the policies, not just justify it, right? But what we really also need to do is concentrate much more on how data is being used and what we can do within policymaking processes to get that to be used. What policy is effective, what policy is ineffective, and who has got policymakers or others to listen. Because otherwise we are just in a situation where we are, as someone has said, sitting and sharing the data with each other, which is nice. It's interesting, we learn, and it's valuable. But if our ultimate goal is protection, informing policy, we actually need to spend much more time, probably less time collecting the data and more time thinking about how those data are being used. So I'm going to end. I'll hand it back to I don't know who. I'll hand it back to Ursula, Jim, to say the final farewells in lieu of our SADC representative. But thank you for the invitation and thank you all for being here. You need the big mic for that.
Thanks very much, everyone, once again for joining this kind of like co-created, co-organized event by MMC, UNHCR, IOM. It was a pleasure to have you all in the room. I sincerely hope it was not the last time, and we can take these recommendations very much forward. I think we should see this as just like an initial brainstorming discussion. And yeah, looking forward to be in touch.